God is good, and each day that passes brings us a day closer to Pantheon Rise of the Fallen launching so we can all play. In the meantime, please join me here at the channel. If you haven't subscribed already, please consider doing so, especially if you're interested in Pantheon Rise of the Fallen, as that is mainly what this channel talks about. Today, I do want to break into a little bit of theory crafting. I want to talk a little bit about something we actually don't know anything about yet, that has not been announced, and that would be racial abilities. I just want to kind of theory craft, talk about and discuss what could be coming for each race, what I think's coming, and I think it's pretty agreeable that these things would make sense, at least on a basic lore level. So let's do this. So I want to start out with the Arkai. The Arkai is a very interesting race, basically because they kind of had the arcane fused into their body, right? It's mentioned very bluntly that even though they are a larger race, that their agility is not affected by that. The Ogre it is, but the Arkai it is not. So as far as stats go, starting stats for the race of the Arkai, then I don't think we're going to have any kind of problem with the agility of them being slower just because they are taller creatures. But what is interesting about the Arkai is it does talk about, of course, that they're fused with the arcane ability. And what makes that interesting, you can actually see it on the character. So you can kind of see this kind of magic kind of coming through them, right? Coming through their skin, kind of like cracks in their skin. You can see just light beaming out. Now, by the way it's described, it sounds as though at a young age, maybe geographically decided, not really sure with the way that's worded, but they do have a type of arcane that each one has within them. Like it could be earth, or it could be fire, ice, or something like that. But it can vary depending on the Arkai. Now, can the Arkai absorb depending on their own circumstances as they get older? I'm not sure. But it does seem as though, the way that it's worded, at least in the lore on the Pantheon MMO website, the official lore on it so far, that basically at a younger age they are kind of infused with the specific type of magical arcane ability inside them. Now that makes me feel like that when you make an Arkai character, if that's what you're going to decide to play, that it could be possible that you pick that. Which arcane ability are you going to start with? Let's say you pick ice. So number one, your character is going to look more white or blue, bursting through the skin and those cracked parts of the character. And number two, would that decision make you, like for example, be able to absorb ice-based attacks? I think so. Would it also make you able to resist and you know, be able to go, not just resist frost attacks, but also go into like the very cold climates and have a little bit of natural resistance against it? I think so. I think that's very possible. I also think that the Arkai maybe actually isn't just born with one, but maybe they absorb it based on where they are at the moment. That would be cool too. So for example, if you're in a hot area, extreme heat, then maybe they absorb that over time. Like if you spend enough time in that area, then they'll kind of absorb that and their color will change to match that. And then basically you're in a hot area, probably fighting fire type creatures, and it's going to make the Arkai more immune to it. Of course they're not going to be completely immune, that'd be ridiculous, but just some innate kind of a resist to that. And maybe it's not automatic. If you go from cold and then you head to a heated area or whatever, then maybe it takes some time, like you need to acclimate to that area as a natural ability. They acclimate to it and they begin getting resistance against it. That's pretty much what I think of when I think of the Arkai and what they might do with the abilities as far as the ratio goes. And as I mentioned before, even though they're larger, it's plainly stated on the website, on the races under Arkai, that their agility will not be affected with their stats, even though they are larger. So that gives us a little bit of a peek into what starting out as an Arkai could be like. Now let's move on to the Dwarves, alright? The Dwarves are very interesting. I'm personally considering playing one, and because I'm going to main Paladin, this is why at this point in time I'm really considering the Dwarf is a perfect match for the Paladin, or a tanking type class. Because number one, we know if you read the lore of the dwarves that they have a natural cold or frost resist, or at least they better, because they were created out of ice and rock. So they should have a natural cold / frost resist. Now, I would see that just like when talking about the Arkai, I would see that in meaning two different things. Number one, a frost type spell on the dwarf should have some resist. Also, in a cold environment, they should be acclimated already to that. In other words, they should have an innate ability to resist colder areas. Now, obviously, I don't think they'll make it to where a dwarf needs no other type of acclimation. I just think they'll need less gear and things to help in extreme cold weather. Because why? Because they're made by the lore out of ice and rock. So another thing I want to talk about the dwarf, though, is the other side of that, the rock part. So they should theoretically have more constitution, I guess you could say, a hardier race than the others, being that that's what they're made out of. And another interesting thing about the dwarves that I like to think of is, if you look into lore, it mentions that they were gifted the ability to make items out of cold dark steel, which is like a ridiculously like adamantite type material, basically, that can be cut as thin as cloth, but it's very, very, very durable. And I thought it would be cool, since that was gifted to them by their pantheon, if that would be a thing that they could do only. Like, how cool would that be if the cold dark steel only comes from the dwarves, and it can be used by other players that do smithing to make weapons and armor, but the dwarves are the ones that have the ability to get that since it came from them. That could not be true, but I think that would be cool. And another thing on that subject is that the dwarves should also, in my opinion, have a innate ability to be able to smith faster or better. I don't want to say better, because maybe that wouldn't be fair, but maybe their experience gain for smithing is quicker. They get an XP boost to smithing, since that's literally what they were made to do by their pantheon. So I think the dwarf is very interesting because of those things, because the lore seems, in my opinion, to point directly to their racial abilities. Now let's talk about the Mirr. Okay, the Mirr is very interesting. This is the race so far that my wife is considering playing, especially since we now know they can be clerics. So the Mirr, I think, is kind of obvious. They are going to have a faster swim speed. They're gonna, because they can turn into the mermaid, right? Like, they can get the fin in the water, so they should be able to travel really fast in water. Is it possible that they'll be giving a racial ability to allow the party to travel as fast as they do? Possibly. Possibly not, though, because their party is not a Mirr. And Mirrs don't like the other races, keep in mind. According to the lore, they really actually hate the other races. So what I was thinking was it would be really cool, I think, if the Mirr could get bonuses the more other Mirr are in the party. Now, I know that some people claim that could be like game breaking or whatever, because then you'd have groups of people only wanting to group with other Mirrs, etc. But I think that would be cool, and it makes sense to the lore, because they don't like the other races at all. So the Mirr would be more apt to stick with their own kind, and it would be cool if they wanted that to play out in the game, so they wanted players to kind of behave that way, to kind of keep the lore going, and make it, more obvious as you look around, and Mirrs aren't really joining as many parties as other races. Why? Because they get a bonus for only grouping with other Mirrs, because they don't like the other races. I think that would be cool. On top of the fact that they can travel obviously faster and obviously with more ease underwater, maybe even getting buffs as when they are underwater, since that would be their natural home, it would be in the water. So maybe when they fight underwater, or maybe they get spell healing buffs and damage buffs and things like that, I think that would be cool. So that's my thought on the Mirr. Alright, now let's talk about the Ogres. Okay, so the Ogres are maybe a little bit obvious. They're a huge race. They're very powerful, very strong, and they are going to be affected as far as base stats go, in my opinion, with agility is going to be lower. Why do I say that? Well, because it's specifically mentioned when talking about the Arkai that, unlike the Ogres, that their size doesn't slow them down, basically doesn't affect their agility. So I do believe the Ogres will start with a base stat of agility much lower. In other words, they'll be a slower but more powerful race. So they'll be really good at damage, you know, whacking things brutally. When I think of a ogre in C1, I don't even think of one holding a sword. I think of, you know, like a sword and board. I think of an ogre with a gargantuan two-handed mace or hammer, just, you know, using all of his power and strength to just crush things. And I think that's what the ogre's going to be good at. If we look at the ogre as far as what options the ogre has, let's see, the ogre can be a dire lord, which I think they'd be a very good dire lord, because the dire lord is very damage based. They can be a druid, which is very interesting. They can also be a shaman, and they can be a warrior. So warrior, dire lord, those are going to be, if you're going to be an ogre, you can be any of them. Obviously the game's going to allow you to be any of those four, but I believe the warrior and the dire lord are going to be the first pick for an ogre as far as using his base stats and what he's meant to do to absolutely demolish everything. So if you're planning on playing warrior or dire lord, I think you'd be hard pressed to find a better race than the ogre. And that's really all I can think of to say about the ogres. They're just going to be really stout and strong. As far as special abilities, maybe like a rage, I could see something like that. Like they're a very warish type people from their lore, you know, going to war, conquering, that kind of thing. So I could see maybe an ability like a rage. Like, I don't know, they take too many hits, so the health gets low, and they burst into a rage, maybe, and increases their DPS, maybe gives them a little bit more constitution. I could see them starting with a lot of constitution to begin with, too, on their base stats. But I could see maybe something like that, like a rage or a berserk type status. Alright, so now let's talk about the humans, alright? The most boring of all the races, but, you know, if I don't pick a dwarf, that's probably what I'll be. So, the humans. If you look at the lore, it kind of fits in with, you know, the Lord of the Rings type of lore, as far as what's happened to them and their great king and all that kind of thing. And the humans are seen as a very persistent, courageous type race. It's mentioned more than once, their ability to lead. That seems to be the quantifiable identity of the humans. So, what I believe, if I had to guess what an ability given specifically to the humans would be, I'm going to have to go with it would be something to do with giving the group they're in some sort of buff. I don't know how they would decide to do that. It could go any which way. But I think that they'll give the humans some sort of group-wide something. Something that would be called something to do with leadership, right? Pulled up Avendir, who was their king. He had a famous speech called the Speech of Souls, which is repeated amongst humans and elves even today. And basically it says, when it talks about what this Speech of Souls was, that it was credited with reviving the hearts of the surviving dead, in other words, the survivors. A reference to broken-hearted victors of the war. So, kind of like an encouraging, maybe a buff to increase endurance, or endurance regen, or something like that, maybe. That might be a little bit overpowered, but something like that. It won't be anything too bold, but maybe just something. It will. I just honestly believe it's going to be group related. It's going to be something that would make the human seem like the leader type, since that's the way that they are focused upon in their lore. And also, I'd like to mention that the humans are the only race that can be any class in the game. Alright, so that kind of tells me that their stats are probably going to be very across the board at a base point of starting the game. I can see their abilities as kind of being just kind of a little bit of everything, just kind of spread out. Alright, so the Halflings. This is an interesting race. It reminds me, when you read about them, something similar to the Hobbits, maybe. But basically, the Halflings, they're mentioning their agility, speed, that kind of thing. Perfect for a rogue. I think perfect also for a bard, because they're also a very musical race. So, as far as a racial ability, guessing, of course, because we have absolutely no idea on any of these, but with the Halfling, I could see maybe them getting some sort of speed buff. Being able to travel on foot faster. That just seems like they're a nomadic race. In their past, they traveled around. Sure, they finally settled down, made a home. But it even mentions that they are very likely to leave home and run about. More likely than to stay there, as you might think of like a hobbit or something, wanting to stay in the Shire. They're more nomadic and willing to flee and travel about. everything talking about the halfling has to do with agility or travel. So I could definitely see some sort of speed buff as far as the halfling goes. And as far as their base stats go, it's pretty obvious that their agility will be at a base much higher than the other races, probably the highest out of any of the races, which will be great for something like a rogue. Alright, so now let's talk about the elves. So the elves in the lore, it's a lot to do with their tree, kind of like Yggdrasil, a world tree kind of thing. So basically, that's a lot to do with, foresty type situation. So basically, this is kind of a wild idea, but when I think of forest and all that, I kind of think of healing or regeneration, things to do with the forest and that type of thing. So what if the elf got an ability, a racial ability, where they could maybe summon the spirit of their world tree? It was destroyed in the lore, but if they could, summon like a beautiful like spirit of the tree, and it rains down regen for a short period of time, or something of that nature. Or maybe it's just a nature-based attack, since they are very foresty, to where it's, something to do with regeneration. I mean out of battle regeneration. Ticking faster for elves, for HP or MP or that kind of thing. That's kind of what I think of for the elf. Alright, now if my theories didn't get crazy enough, I want to talk about the Skar. So the Skar is very interesting as far as the lore and everything goes. Very savage and tribal and raw. So I noticed something and I couldn't help but make something more of it. So it mentions a prison type situation with the Skar, and the prisoners kind of guard themselves. Why? Because they cannibalize themselves. That makes, of course, you hear the word cannibalize, you're going to think of the shaman from EverQuest. So that's what I think of. Wouldn't it be cool? And keep in mind, the Skar can be a shaman. That's one of the classes available to them. But wouldn't it be cool? Maybe a little overpowered, maybe a little ridiculous. But wouldn't it be cool if the Skar got the ability to cannibalize, to regen their MP or their HP, or maybe even both? What if they made it even cooler than it was in EQ? What if they made it to where a Skar, when you kill an enemy, maybe it would be like only a human type, or only of this type, or humanoid type, I mean, you could actually cannibalize the corpse. You could actually eat it and devour it at the end of the battle and get a tick of HP or MP or whatever. How cool would that be? Probably not going to happen. Probably a ridiculous theory, but I love it and I had to put it in the video. Now the last one I haven't talked about is the Gnome, and I'm going to be honest with you, the Gnome it's almost as hard as the elf or the human to talk about. It's just, they could do anything. I have no idea. I'm not a huge fan of the Gnome race, to be honest with you, almost ever. I don't know any kind of fantasy world where I like the Gnomes. I think the Gnomes are the coolest in Pantheon out of any of the others, mainly because they kind of left their body and they've kind of spiritual form, and they have to, wear the mask and everything. It's pretty cool. I have no idea where they're going to go with this. The Gnome is pure arcane energy. So I don't know. Something, maybe it would be cool if maybe you could like drop the clothes they're wearing and just be like pure energy and go into stealth mode and maybe zip past some enemies and get deeper into a dungeon by yourself solo. Something like that would be cool. I have no idea. The human, the elf, and the gnome are almost impossible because they could just do anything. I mean, absolutely almost anything. So I have no idea. But guys, what do you think? Do you agree with some of the things I said? I know the Skar is probably the coolest thing that I probably mentioned, I think, and it's going to bring back a lot of good memories for anybody that played Shaman back in the day on EverQuest. What do you think? Leave some comments below. Do you have any theories of what you think they might do for the racial abilities? I hope you enjoyed the video. If you're not subscribed already, please consider doing so, as this is what we do here at the Nathan Napalm channel, is talk about Pantheon, Rise of the Fallen, old school MMOs, etc. I hope you enjoyed today's video. Have a great day, God bless, and happy gaming.